All right, let's dive into something pretty interesting today. We're going to be talking about the adrenochrome hypothesis of schizophrenia.
Hmm?
This has been a theory that's been around for a while, and it's always, that always comes with its share of controversy. So it seemed like the perfect thing for us to take a deep dive into. You sent over this really interesting research paper from 2009 that kind of revisits this whole idea, and I'm curious to get your take on it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area to explore. Schizophrenia research has gone back and forth, kind of between, is it a physical problem, is it a biochemical problem, or is it psychosocial? And as we've gotten better at figuring out the specific causes for certain forms of psychosis, like, infections or hormonal imbalances, we're left with this kind of core group of schizophrenia cases that we don't have a clear explanation for. So the adrenochrome hypothesis is trying to, fill in that gap.
So we're not going to just like skim the surface here. We're going to really kind of dig into this hypothesis. Like, what's the core idea? What's the evidence?
Yeah, so the basic premise is that an excess of adrenochrome, which is a substance that's produced from the oxidation of adrenaline, could be a contributing factor to schizophrenia. And one of the early clues was the fact that adrenochrome is structurally similar to some known hallucinogens like LSD and mescaline.
Oh, that's an interesting starting point. I imagine studying adrenochrome was kind of difficult.
You're absolutely right. One of the big challenges with studying adrenochrome was its instability. It breaks down very quickly, which makes it hard to research. So researchers had to develop methods to create stable forms of it so they could actually study it in the lab.
So, okay, they figured out a way to study it, but is there even evidence that it's present in the body naturally? Or is this a purely theoretical substance?
No, there's actually evidence for that. The research paper that you sent over, it highlights a couple of instances where adrenochrome has been found to form in tissues, for example, in rabbit heart tissue. They've also found it in salivary glands and even in the intestinal mucosa. So it's definitely not just a hypothetical substance. It is being generated within living organisms.
Okay, so that's a crucial detail. It makes this a lot more tangible. So we know it exists, we know it's in the body, but how does it supposedly lead to schizophrenia? Like, what's the mechanism?
Right. So the hypothesis kind of lays out a biochemical pathway where adrenaline gets oxidized into adrenochrome. And then adrenochrome can be broken down into two different substances. One is called leukoadrenochrome, and that one doesn't have hallucinogenic properties. And the other one is called adrenoleukin, and that's the one that does have hallucinogenic properties.
So the theory is that people with schizophrenia, they might have like an imbalance in this pathway where they're producing more of the adrenoleukin.
Precisely, yeah. And then there's also the potential for a genetic component.
Yeah.
Where certain people might be genetically predisposed to
They-
producing more adrenaline.
Now, I remember the paper talked about some other interesting effects of adrenochrome. I think one of them was it has antihistamine properties, and that could be why some people with schizophrenia experience fewer physical allergy symptoms.
Right. Could it be that this antihistamine effect is sort of a defense mechanism against some kind of internal inflammation or something like that?
So that's why they don't experience allergies as strongly.
Yeah.
But then if that defense mechanism goes awry, then it leads to a buildup of the hallucinogenic adrenoleukin.
Yeah, exactly. And then another interesting fact is that adrenochrome also has antimitotic properties, which means that it inhibits cell division. And this might be related to the observation that some people with schizophrenia have slower hair and nail growth.
That makes me think. I wonder if there's also a connection with aging. Like, could it be that there's a trade-off where outward signs of aging are slowed down, but then internally there's a faster accumulation of like age pigment in the brain or something?
Yeah, you're thinking like a scientist. That's a really interesting idea that probably warrants further investigation. And it shows the complexity of this hypothesis. It goes beyond just hallucinations. There are all these other potential effects of adrenochrome on the body and the brain.
This is already turning into a fascinating deep dive. And we haven't even gotten to the part about vitamins B3 and B6 yet.
Right, that's a whole other aspect of this.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm very interested to hear more.
Let's get into it.
All right, so we're back. And last time we ended on this cliffhanger about vitamins B3 and B6 and how they could be involved in this whole adrenochrome thing. I got to say that part of the research paper really piqued my interest.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff in there about that.
Okay, so let's dive into the specifics. Like, what exactly does the research say about these vitamins and adrenochrome?
Okay, well, the paper highlights this finding, that vitamin B3, which is also called niacin, it can actually counteract some of the effects of adrenochrome. And we're talking about like behavioral changes and even brainwave activity.
So it's like if you're experiencing those adrenochrome-induced effects, the niacin could step in and mitigate them or something.
That seems to be what the research is suggesting, yeah. And there's even this interesting finding that niacin can lessen the effects of LSD, which remember has that similar structure to adrenochrome.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty compelling connection.
Yeah.
So it's like the niacin is acting as a buffer,
Yeah.
and it's interrupting that pathway that would normally lead to the hallucinogenic byproducts.
So then what about vitamin B6? Where does that fit in?
So vitamin B6, this is where it gets a little complicated. It's related to a substance called cryptopyrrole, or KP. And this KP molecule, it can actually bind to B6 and make it unavailable for the body to use.
So it basically creates a B6 deficiency then, but how does that relate to schizophrenia?
Well, here's the interesting part. KP itself has been shown to be hallucinogenic in animals.
No kidding.
So it makes you wonder if KP could also be involved in human schizophrenia.
Wow, so now we've got this other potential hallucinogenic substance on top of the adrenochrome.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Mm.
This whole thing is making me think about vitamin deficiencies and mental health in general. The paper also mentioned pellagra, that B3 deficiency, which can actually cause symptoms that are similar to schizophrenia.
Right, that's a really important point. I mean, the fact that pellagra exists and that it can cause these psychosis-like symptoms, it kind of lends more support to the idea
Right.
that these B vitamins, especially B3, are really crucial for mental well-being.
Okay, so we've got these B vitamins potentially influencing this adrenochrome pathway. But the paper also explored this idea of cerebral allergies, like how certain foods can affect the brain.
Oh yeah, that was a fascinating part of the paper. The idea there is that for people who are already genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, cerebral allergies could be a trigger for the condition.
So it's like they have this underlying vulnerability, and then this sensitivity to certain foods kind of sets things in motion. How does adrenochrome fit into all that?
Well, remember how we were talking about adrenochrome having antihistamine properties? The paper suggests that this could be the body's way of defending itself against these allergens. So when someone with a cerebral allergy eats a trigger food, their body releases adrenaline, and then that gets converted into adrenochrome to try and calm down the allergic response.
There's like a protective mechanism in a way.
Yeah.
But then things go haywire when the adrenochrome is broken down further.
Right, because some of it gets converted into the harmless leukoadrenochrome, but some of it might get converted into the hallucinogenic adrenoleutin. And in those people, this defense mechanism could backfire and contribute to psychotic symptoms.
So it's like the body's trying to protect itself, but it ends up creating this other problem.
It's a delicate balance, for sure.
It really emphasizes how complicated all this is. Genetics, biochemistry, environmental triggers. It's not just one thing.
It's like a big web of interconnected factors.
And that brings us back to those other big theories of schizophrenia, like the dopamine hypothesis. Does the adrenochrome hypothesis, clash with those theories?
Yeah.
Or could they coexist?
I think it's more about adding another layer of explanation. Like, for example, dopamine itself can be oxidized into potentially harmful substances. And this process could be influenced by the same factors that are affecting adrenochrome.
So maybe instead of contradicting each other, these theories actually work together to give us a more complete picture.
Exactly. Science is about building on what we know and integrating different perspectives.
This is already so much to process, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. But before we move on, I'd love to get your thoughts on the implications of all this. Like, if the adrenochrome hypothesis does turn out to be right, what could that mean for treatment and prevention?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's what we'll be discussing in our next segment. We'll delve into the potential implications of the adrenochrome hypothesis and what it could mean for the future of schizophrenia research.
All right, so here we are, the final part of our deep dive into adrenochrome and schizophrenia. We've talked about the background, the mechanisms, even the vitamins. But the big question is so what? If this hypothesis is actually true, what does it mean?
Well, that's when things get really exciting. I mean, if adrenochrome is really a key player in some schizophrenia cases, it could totally change how we approach treatment and prevention.
Yeah, instead of just managing the symptoms, we could actually try to fix the problem.
Exactly. Like we talked about niacin maybe that can help counteract the adrenochrome.
Yeah.
And then there's B6, making sure people aren't deficient.
That's
so that
right.
cryptopyrrole doesn't become a problem.
Yeah.
And of course, figuring out those food sensitivities.
So there's like a whole new set of tools we could use.
Exactly. And treatment could become much more personalized.
Yeah, it wouldn't be one size fits all anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have to remember, this is still just a hypothesis. We need way more research.
Oh, absolutely. This research paper is a great starting point. But it's just a limited number of studies. We need much larger trials to really figure out how important this pathway is.
And to see if these potential treatments actually work.
Yeah.
Like does taking niacin or B6 really make a difference in people's lives?
Exactly. We need real-world data.
And there's so much more to explore, right? Like which genes are involved? How does the environment affect adrenochrome production? Can we even change adrenochrome levels safely?
Those are all great questions for future research.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. Schizophrenia is way more complicated than I thought.
It really is a multifaceted puzzle.
But it's encouraging to see that researchers are thinking outside the box, exploring new ideas like this adrenochrome hypothesis.
Definitely. And this paper might be from 2009, but it shows how important it is to re-examine old ideas. Sometimes the answers are right there in front of us.
So to wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with a little something to think about. We know that adrenochrome is natural. It's not necessarily bad. It might even help with anxiety in normal amounts. So could there be a way to use it to our advantage without causing those negative side effects?
That's the million-dollar question. Maybe we can learn to fine-tune this pathway, find that perfect balance.
It's exciting to think about what the future holds for schizophrenia research. Huge thanks to you for guiding us through this deep dive. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. Keep those curious minds engaged, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.